time in Canadian history is a damning indictment on the failure of this Prime Minister to address the situation. The Prime Minister once said, I quote, "When a government asks its citizens to give up even a small portion of their liberty, it is not simply enough to say, trust us. That trust must be earned, it must be checked, and it must be renewed." These are his words. Canadians do not trust this Prime Minister. When will he stop undermining Canadians' rights and start renewing Canadians' trust?
The Honourable Minister for Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians can trust that this government will always follow the science and the best evidence to get us out of this pandemic, and that includes getting vaccinated, Mr. Speaker. And contrary to what my colleague says, this is an illegal blockade. This illegal blockade is not about the vaccines or the mandates. It's about a very small, organized group who are trying to upend our way of life, Mr. Speaker. Now, we've made progress. We've seen the Ambassador Bridge reopened. We've seen Coots reopened. We've seen Surrey reopened. And, Mr. Speaker, yesterday, yes, we invoked the Emergencies Act so that we can secure that progress and give law enforcement all of the tools they need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Well, we'll see if the Prime Minister answers this one. Every opportunity he has had to de-escalate this situation in Ottawa and around Canada, he has chosen to hide, to confront, and to escalate. His divisive conduct has been a lesson in abject failure. Blockades should come down. They are already coming down across this country. But now the Prime Minister has invoked the Emergencies Act to punish Canadians who, in his words, hold unacceptable views. Why is the Prime Minister punishing Canadians for their political views?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
That the former Conservative leader, now the member for Regina Capel with the Conservative Party, said the following: "These protesters, these activists, may have the luxury of spending days at a time at a blockade, but they need to check their privilege. They need to check their privilege and let the people whose jobs depend on the railway system and small business and farmers do their jobs." And what have they said now in this context from the beginning? As swastikas flew, as Confederate flags flew, they went out and they gave coffee. They took pictures. They have absolutely the opposite of responsible leadership. Instead of de-escalating, they escalated at every turn.
Can we go on? Oral questions. Question orale. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister invoked the Emergencies Act. 24 hours in, and there are more questions than answers. Questions about whether this is justified, questions around if the criteria is met, questions around what this means to Canadians' rights and freedoms. Parliamentary approval is required in order for the Prime Minister to use this unprecedented sledgehammer. So, can the Prime Minister tell us, when will Parliament be debating this? Will it be coming to us on Friday? And does he expect that we will look at it Friday, but then rise, take a week off, and not actually deal with this until March?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, after discussions with Cabinet and caucus, after consultations with the premiers of all provinces and territories, after conversation with the opposition leaders, we decided to invoke the Emergencies Act to supplement provincial and territorial capacity to address the blockades and occupations. I want to be very clear, Mr. Speaker. The scope of these measures are time-limited and geographically targeted. They are reasonable and proportionate to the threats they are meant to address, and they are fully to be compliant with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms to reassure all Canadians that this is the right thing to move forward with.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
I had a very simple question to the Prime Minister he was not able to answer. It would appear this could be more political drama for the Prime Minister. He name-calls people that he disagrees with. He wedges, he divides, he stigmatizes. Yet in spite of all of his failure, Coots border has cleared. Windsor has opened up. Provinces and police are doing their jobs, and blockades are starting to come down. But the Prime Minister thinks that now is the time to use this extreme measure and invoke the Emergencies Act. Isn't it true that the Prime Minister's actions could serve to actually make things worse and not make things better?
Exactly. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, this is about keeping Canadians safe, protecting their communities and neighbourhoods, and ensuring the jobs and our economy.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt the Right Honourable Prime Minister. I'm trying to hear the answer, and I'm having a very difficult time. There's some shouting going on. I'm going to have to ask the honourable members to maybe just keep it down. And if you've got something that you're not agreeing with, talk amongst yourself with someone next to you. You don't have to shout it out to the person across the floor. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, you are absolutely right. This is a time for responsible leadership, not crass partisanship. The situation requires additional tools not held by other federal, provincial, or territorial law. It's what responsible leadership requires. These measures must be and will be compliant with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We will always defend the rights of Canadians to peaceful assembly and to freedom of expression, but these blockades need to end, and unfortunately, Conservative politicians continue to encourage the leaders of these blockades.
Well, Leader of the Opposition.
Well, let's get down to the basics of what this is really about. This is about the Prime Minister's ideological attachment to keeping COVID restrictions and mandates. 63% of Canadians want the restrictions and mandates to end. Conservatives presented a motion yesterday asking simply for a plan, but the Prime Minister is in denial and is ignoring the science. He might as well be back at the cottage because he's doing nothing productive or constructive to help this situation. Can the Prime Minister tell Canadians when he will end the divisive, outdated and unscientific mandate and restrictions?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, like I said, this is a time for responsible leadership to end these blockades. Unfortunately, the Conservatives continue to play partisan games. The Conservative member of Provencher just yesterday...
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut off the Prime Minister just for a second. And just... I mean, heckling is usually throwing one comment out. Clever, hopefully, although not always necessary. But what I'm hearing is someone bullying and trying to drown someone out. That's not heckling. I just want everyone to take a deep breath, and I'll let the Prime Minister start from the top, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, we see that even in a moment of extremely challenging times, when people are moving forward with responsible leadership and responsible tools, the Conservatives can't help themselves but play crass political games and divide. The Conservative member for Provencher just yesterday embraced the leaders of this blockade and amplified their cause. The Conservative member for Yorkton Melville said this weekend that blockaders who ripped down fencing around our national war memorial are patriots. The Conservative leadership contender from Carleton continues to say he's proud.
L'honorable député de Louis. The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, for 17 days, the Prime Minister didn't lift a finger over what was happening in Ottawa. Instead, he insulted people who didn't share his opinion. As a result, yesterday, the Prime Minister pulled out an act that hasn't been used for half a century. He didn't consult the premiers. He just informed them. But more than half of them are against this. And the Prime Minister is simply pouring oil on the fire. Why does the Prime Minister always try to cover up his inaction in this way? The Honourable Prime Minister. Since the outset, Mr. Speaker, we've been working responsibly with local authorities, with various jurisdictions to combat this illegal blockade. And we will continue to ensure that local police have all the tools they need. And that's precisely what we did yesterday. We brought additional tools to the table that local police, the police of jurisdiction, can use when dealing with blockades and roadblocks. I know the opposition tends to support those who are blocking our economy, but we do not. The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, Canadians have seen in recent days that things were improving without the Emergencies Act. That happened in Ontario, it happened in Alberta, and it could have happened here in Ottawa. But no, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister would prefer to invoke legislation that hasn't been used in 50 years, to continue to divide and insult and provoke instead of looking for a compromise. Why does the Prime Minister not consult Canadians and premiers, including his own member from Louis Hébert? The Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, Canadians are sick and tired of COVID and restrictions, but they're also tired of people blocking their streets and impeding their access to goods and services. And that's why we've had to take responsible steps to allow the provinces and local jurisdictions to maintain supply chains and keep our streets clear of illegal demonstrations. We will always be there to support our police forces with the tools that are charter consistent and to protect our values and rights. The honourable member for Chambly. Mr. Speaker, Ottawa has lost control over Ottawa, but the Ambassador Bridge situation was solved without the Emergencies Act. The situation in Quebec was managed very well without the Emergencies Act. The Prime Minister made a commitment to limit the geographic use of the Emergencies Act, but the actual order doesn't say that at all. Will the Prime Minister promise to explicitly exclude Quebec from the application of this emergency order? The Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Emergencies Act gives additional tools to police forces all across the country in an emergency situation, as we've seen all over the country, more or less, and in many places. They have managed to deal with these barricades, but we know that the risk remains a fact, and it's up to local police in Quebec or elsewhere. They will have the tools available to them if they need them, Mr. Speaker. Those measures are proportionate, they're responsible, and they will only be used if needed by local police. The honourable member for Belleuil-Chambly. Mr. Speaker, the parties at the National Assembly in Quebec aren't interested. The government of Quebec is not interested. The Bloc Québécois is not interested either. And I hear among our neighbours that Alberta is not interested, Saskatchewan's not interested, Manitoba's not interested. Is the Prime Minister shopping around? Is he looking for support to impose legislation in Quebec against Quebec's will? The Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Emergencies Act applies against illegal barricades and blockades that may crop up here and there all around the country. This is a response that we have come up with. It's responsible, it's proportionate, and it's limited both in time and in its geographic application. And it still protects our rights and freedoms under the Charter. We are reacting responsibly, and we will continue to be there for Canadians who are suffering. The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Sadly, we are in this crisis because we've seen a failure to take this crisis seriously at all levels of government. And now we're seeing Indigenous and racialized people look at the double standard that the convoy is being treated as compared to those protesters. And we also have deeply disturbing reports of military and police personnel who've expressed sympathy and support for the convoy. So will the Prime Minister provide assurances in this House that the police will use the powers given to protect people and not support the occupation?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the measured and responsible use of the Emergencies Act that we announced yesterday gives specific time-limited proportional tools to police of local jurisdiction and their partners to be able to ensure that these illegal blockades end, to make sure that people who have now fully been heard by all Canadians choose to go home. These are the things that Canadians expect from their orders of government, and I can say that we have worked extremely closely across orders of government with all different polices of jurisdiction to ensure that Canadians get their streets and their lives back.
Well, member for Burnaby South.
Mismanagement by the government in the Soviet Union. And the irony is, right,
I didn't know that.
It's one of the most frail sections and the irony is, one of the world's great famines occurred in the Soviet Union.
How come?
Mismanagement by the government. Milton Friedman once said that if the government took over the Sahara Desert, there would be a shortage of sand. And in the Soviet Union, it was just that way.
All right.